A new documentary is hitting Australian cinemas in May, a documentary called Watandar-My Countryman. And as always, it's my great pleasure to be speaking to the director of the film, Jolyon Hoff, and the subject of the film, of course, Muzafar Ali. Welcome to Movie Metropolis.
Thank you. The star of the film, even.
The star, yes, as lead actor. All right. Now, I know that you've worked with Muzafar before. I know that, Muzafar, you've been in Australia now for 7 years or more.
7 years now. Yeah.
7 years, yep. So tell me about this documentary, which especially focuses on the Afghan history of the Cameliers, etc., and so on.
Thank you. I came up. I'm a student of law, policy, and politics as well. So one of my courses was about the culture and diversity in Australia, where I learned the Australia's modern history, how colonization shaped the modern Australia, and how the Australian society came out of that White Australia policy, and then um, discrimination against the Aboriginal people. So I was very shocked to see the modern history of Australia is so bleak. And I, as a newly arrived migrant or refugee in Australia, was raising questions about the Australia's dark history and the treatment of Aboriginal people. And then during these researches, I came up with the part where I realized that Afghans came to Australia in 1860s. And then I was thinking that was a voluntary migration, but my migration is not voluntary, it's involuntary. I had to flee from Afghanistan, and I did not think that I will end up in Australia. So that's why I was really interested to know more about Australia's modern history, the contribution of Afghans in Australia, and how Australia that today we see has come up to this stage. So I saw many people that they were from the stolen generation, the Afghan Camelier descendants. I met, they were a stolen generation, and they were telling me the stories of their ancestors' contribution in Australia. So I was thinking, what will happen to my daughter? Is she going to be the same? Will she face the same treatment the way the Cameliers' ancestors received? And that's how we took off on this journey to investigate and to know more about the descendants and also the ancestors, the whole story. So it was a fascinating journey for me. It's an eye-opening journey to see those remote communities, the contribution, immense contribution of the Afghan Cameliers in the deserts.
Yeah.
So for me, I learned a lot in this process. So yeah, we can discuss more in detail, but for me, it was such a privilege to be part of those communities. And yeah, this film is just a small part of it. At this particular time where we lost hope in Afghanistan, we don't have any hope that Afghanistan will get better any. So we have to think that this is our country. Australia is our country. Australia will be home for my daughter and for my next generations. So, and this film contributes to the new Australia, the modern, diverse Australia, with the history mostly hidden from the most of the Australians.
How very interesting. So, and I know I've seen a few films, Australian films, that have referenced the Cameliers. So I knew a little bit about that. They've been Afghan Cameliers have been in Australia for a long time. But putting this together as a film with your journey, Muzafar, and Jolyon directing this film, tell me about that process.
Well, you know, when Muzafar kind of excitedly discovered, or I don't know excitedly, but discovered that Afghans had been here for 160 years, we started to talk about it. And I knew that as he went on this journey to photograph their descendants, he was going to learn things about Australia that he didn't know, that I kind of knew, but I also knew that Muzafar would have a different perspective on that journey. So yeah, you know, maybe like you, Peter, I know about the Cameliers, and I know that they were there, but always in the school books when we were learning the modern history, we might learn about Burke and Wills, and there'd be some exotic looking camels in the background. You know, they were almost like side characters. But Muzafar was very interested in who were those people? Who were those people that you know, what did they do when they were out there in the harsh desert and leading their camel trains? So I feel that, and I hope the film achieved that Muzafar has a very different perspective, that he draws our attention onto who those people were, not who the cameleers were as kind of exotic kind of backdrop to our own colonial history. So yeah, so we went on the journey, I think it's a fascinating space. The other reason I thought it was such a fascinating space is that in the Afghan cameleers and in Mari in particular, which is kind of the penultimate scenes in the film, we have Afghans, indigenous and colonial or modern or, you know, European history all tied in together. You know, they're all part of the same story. They are part of the same story. And I feel that out there in that kind of remote desert space is an example for what Australia is going to be in the next 200 years. What's Australia going to be? These communities, indigenous, immigrant, colonial or European, all our histories are going to have to mesh together, and they're going to have to become one, and that they are going to become one as we become more multicultural and more global. So I think there's an example there within the Cameleer descendants, there's an example of the possibilities, there's an example of the mistakes, and I think we can all kind of learn from that journey.
And for me, Peter, this process was, as I said, it was an enlightening process for me, because the first encounter of me with Cameleer descendant, I was precautioned because I'm a photographer as well. Be careful when you take photos because of their indigenous heritage, or being isolated to they're living in mainly in remote communities, so they might be hostile to the cameras and being photographed. But what I saw was in contrary, was that instant connection. You know, we are connected through that cultural heritage. We belong to the same country, Afghanistan, and that's why the name film's name come from Watandar, like my countrymen. I didn't feel I was a stranger with them. They looked like me. I didn't see like someone I'm meeting that could speak different language, but they were upholding a lot of my cultural heritage. The cultural practices that they were doing, I could identify. For example, pouring water on the grave, charity food for their gathering in Mari. They're like very good signs where, and also praying on the graves as well. So there are also signs of the modern Afghan tradition as well, which gives me really big hope. And for me, that's also a message that, you know, culture prevails, tradition prevails, and how strong these Cameleers were that could transfer their cultural aspects to the next generations, despite there is no pathway for them to be allowed to openly express their culture because of the White Australia policy.
So the culture, it was fascinating that the culture was weak because of the pressures that had been under, but also still 160 years away, and still you recognized. I mean, the strength of that, the strength of that cultural practice and lineage to be able to follow through all that trauma and over, you know, the other side of the world, and still for Muzafar to feel it, that's really something very special.
Yeah, absolutely.
So interesting to hear that, and that whole notion of inclusiveness and of cultural development and change and so on is just so fascinating. So tell me about the filmmaking process in terms of the people that you met, Muzafar, and also the actual role of making the film and putting it together.
Okay, the question, if it's for me, we set up for a journey of unknown. I was stunned one day when I met one of my friends. For the first time, I met him in Adelaide, and he changed his son's name to Jackson. He's from Afghanistan, and he's a painter here in Adelaide. So I asked him, why did you change your son's name from Afghani name to very English name? So he said, oh, it's uh, just for him to get a good job. And I was so shocked, because do we need to assimilate in Australia? Do we need to change the name to get a job here? And that was kind of the start of our journey. And I shared this with Jolyon. And then we met with the Afghan Camelier descendants. As I said, they were very warm, welcoming, hosting us, talking with us, sharing their stories. We visited their home in their towns. So I was doing one to connect with those descendants and simultaneously photographing them, their cultural heritage, their home, and their current life, and also listening to their stories as well. And at the same time, we saw Afghanistan collapsing under Taliban control. And we had to deal with a lot of issues back in Afghanistan, because I worked in the UN for 7 years. I made many friends, those friends who worked with the American forces, those who worked with the Australian government, those who worked with the UN. And I was dealing with that situation as well. So this was not just a linear film, but it was a lot happening in the backdrop of the film. Jolyon kept filming this whole process, that what we are doing. For example, Karbalai is one of the characters in Afghanistan who had just 2 rooms, a small house. When Taliban came, he had to leave, and he had to think maybe 1,000 times, should he leave or not his 2-room house. But eventually he had to leave, and I could feel his pain, because I went through the same process. I had to leave my possessions. I had to leave my everything behind in Afghanistan, and to go to a journey which I don't know where does it end. So he was taking that journey now, and I was investigating the notion of identity here in Australia. For me, it all connects, because displacement is a generational phenomena for us as Afghans. It was happening in 1860s. It's happening now. So what happens when we end up in countries like Australia? So the whole thing was, for me, I often tell Jolyon, I said, this is our life, but for Australians, this could be a film. But we live in this whole schema of the things which is happening around.
There's definitely a theme of connection to country. I think there's definitely a theme in Watandar-My Countryman, and an idea that we were thinking about the whole time of how that country changes us, how it gets into us. And that story about Karbalai, this humble man in a very remote part of Afghanistan, this tiny little house that the Taliban were all around him, he's kind of sworn enemies of him, but still he didn't want to leave this little place, because he was so connected to that. His identity was so connected to that place. And I think, I think in Australia, the new arrivals are still slowly getting that connection. Maybe after 40,000 years, we'll have that same deep connection that the Indigenous do, but we can see that very, very slowly this land is changing us and changing our identity.
Again, so interesting. Yeah. Go on.
Yeah, I was just saying, Peter, that many Australians may ask question why we have people from Afghanistan, or why from Vietnam, or maybe from Ukraine. But this part of the story is much different, that a lot of people, they don't choose to leave their country. They love to be where they are. And yeah, for me, everything came from this migration, the aspect of migration and human movement from one part of the world to the another part, and what happens to the destination like Australia for them.
Absolutely. The stories coming out of Afghanistan with the Taliban and their treatment of women in particular, it's just incredible how people can survive there under those circumstances, and it's of course quite natural to want to leave a place that treats people so badly. It's incredible.
It is. We witnessed the brightest and the most hopeful years of our life and Afghanistan's life after 9/11. And we, as younger generation of people of Afghanistan, we put all our energy into it to see Afghanistan as a prosperous and a happy country. Um, but to see Afghanistan back to that Stone Age time where women cannot work, where women cannot get education, where women come out of their home, I think it's unimaginable to see how backward Afghanistan went. But it's more tragic to see how Western countries are involved into all these things. They came to Afghanistan with war on terror. They installed democracy, and eventually they said, no, Afghan people, they don't want this. We don't want peace. So I think this was Donald Trump's worst decision to start negotiation with the Taliban because they thought it's expensive to stay in Afghanistan. But how come a country being in decades of civil war, America can think that democracy can flourish there? We never had any kind of reconciliation process in Afghanistan. We never had any justice program in Afghanistan to bring those warlords and the war criminals into justice. America gave them positions. They became the governors. They became the vice presidents. So somehow America from day zero, they were involved in the whole Afghanistan process.
I think this is where the parallel between Muzafar says, for us it's a film, for him it's his life. For America it was a dalliance project. It's just a project, and it didn't work and they leave. But what they've left behind is millions of people whose lives it is, who cannot leave.
My wife and I, we had sleepless nights when we saw Taliban were advancing to Kabul. We were literally sitting together on bed and we were crying because we remembered when Taliban came to Bamiyan, we remembered Bamiyan memories. Those days where we could be free and move around and have excursions. And when they came to the Kundi province, we cried again because these are all our hopes, our memories, and our life. And we lost everything. And when they entered in Kabul, the next day, Afghan women, they protested against Taliban. They are the group of people. They are the hope. They are the people who stood against Taliban, and they were the only people. They were neglected. They were overlooked in the past, but they are the most courageous people in Afghanistan. They were not involved in war. They were not involved in corruption. They were not involved even in decision-making processes, but they always stood up against tyranny. And that's where they become the biggest threat for the Taliban, and the bane for women to get education and to work comes from there because they are half of the population. And they may bring big changes if they are involved. So that's one thing that I always say, that we are so lucky that I came to Australia. I don't take this country for granted. And this film is kind of like a mirror or another perspective for the Australians to see when the migrants come, what are circumstances, how Australia treated to the Afghan cameliers in the past and the Aboriginal community as a general. So it's kind of a mixture of history and modern current events.
It's also remarkable how connected, the tagline for our film is, we're all a little bit more connected than we think. And what's remarkable, and I think what we don't think about so often, is that these events in Afghanistan, we are connected. 160 years ago, that cameliers came here, and actually there are thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of people with camelier descendants in their ancestry, and they keep coming out of the woodwork now. So we are connected to this situation in Afghanistan and to those people in Afghanistan. So we hope the film is an enjoyable journey and a historical one, and we hope to kind of grow that. We hope we can grow that space, that point of connection between immigrants, colonials, indigenous people. You know, we can build that story of joining those histories together, because I think that's the secret for Australia and for the future Australia. We're a young country, and that's where we need to go.
Absolutely, a film as an agent of change, and I think that your film is a really good example of that. Just a few quick final questions in terms of the editing process, because it's a very tight 70-minute documentary. Tell me about your process in deciding what scenes were left in and left out, and so on.
Well, when we went through filming, we wanted to make it a journey. So really, we made it a journey of discovery. So one meeting turned into another meeting, turned into another meeting. So we learned along the way as we went. We learned more about the history and about the people and the situation. And so the whole time we were talking about that, you know. And then when Afghanistan fell to the Taliban, that was deeply emotional time for Muzafar. He was on the phone 24 hours a day to friends and colleagues there, and it was obviously important to film that, and then kind of somehow bring it back to the Cameleer history. So when we were editing, it was kind of the challenge was to tie these two themes and stories together, which really come through following Muzafar's journey, because this is his journey. You know, for us, it's as he says, this is just a film, but for him, it's his life. And so I think in this film, we were just really capturing, you know, a couple of years of Muzafar's life and what he went through. And then we're using that to, well, he's a very engaging character. We love following him, but also we get to learn so many things along the way. So it's a bit complicated to describe the process, Peter, in shorthand, but we just whittle away until it feels right. We whittle away till it feels just right, you know, till it feels like we've got the story and it makes sense and the audience responds.
But I think we made this the staging post. That was a great experience. The way the film came up from the refugees' life to establish a school. I think the Watandar film has the same vibe. Like, it's not depressing film in a way that we only talk about racism or discrimination or what happened to the ancestors of the descendants and the Cameleers, but it's about hope as well, because next generation, this current generation, is hope. We lost Afghanistan. We have descendants here. My daughters are growing up in Australia. They're all hope for us. And modern Australia is hope for our next generations. So I think there are some really good scenes that I really wanted that to be part of the film, where my kids were part of it mostly. But Jolyon was very cruel. Just he chopped it because we have to be in 70 minutes and giving that narrative of hope, I think.
A ticker on the donkey.
Yeah.
And the tug of war. A beautiful tug of war in Murray between the new Afghan arrivals and the bush folk, I guess. I don't know, the locals. It was fantastic.
Yeah.
Peter, I think we've got to head off. I think we've got another meeting in a couple of minutes.
Yes. I just wanted to also remark on the music, which is terrific, from Headland.
Murray Patterson and Headland are just absolutely fantastic, and you know they connected very well. And Murray came up to the Cook Up and the Camel Cup and really connected. Terrific, really terrific. He brought like 10 or 15 different musicians together. They record in this amazing studio out the back of Ballina, and really emotional and evocative work. We loved it.
Yes. So how will the film be released? Because I know it's releasing in May.
Yeah, so Muzafar and I are going to go on the road, about 35 Q&A screenings lined up already all around the country. We'll be every day in, day out, and then every day we're in a city, we'll try and do a daytime screening or talk and connect people. And then there'll be a short cinema release, hopefully in the second half of June, in the cinemas where we've done the Q&A. around Refugee Week. So it'll be as widely as we can get it. Will be out there. A combination of regular release and Q&As.
Excellent. What's the website people can go to so they can find out where they can see the film?
Watandar.com.au, WATANDAR.com.au.
Excellent stuff. Jolyon and Muzafar, it's been terrific talking to you, and I wish you well with the film and your continuing journeys.
Thanks very much, Peter. It was a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.